I remember testifying before our Colorado Department, our legislator, excuse me, about the removal of our discount. Our legislator didn't understand because they wanted to recoup some money, and a fee is not a tax, but it was actually a tax benefit or a cost benefit to vendors to get a little money back for the
Mhm.
cost of collection and enforcement and remittance. So, and it was material to them. So it was not a simple, and then, the biggest companies are taking the biggest cost and bearing the biggest risk. So the 3% was a nice little give back to at least give them some compensation for all that compliance they were creating for the state. So, but then that went away for a while because it was a fee and they could do
It
it.
did. Hmm. Yep. I hear you. Okay.
Well, and kind of on that fee note and kind of piggybacking off of the delivery fee, in one of your kind of more recent recordings, you had mentioned kind of the uptick in those like green fees, like the bag fees, stuff on electronic goods and, tires and whatnot, those things that could adversely affect the environment. Um, is that do you let's see. Do you expect kind of that expansion of those going forward? Do you think that's going to be something just
I,
crystal ball as, a tax person who's been working, you know,
I,
in tax for this long that that's going to be just kind of a new thing that we're just going to keep seeing and seeing and seeing?
I do. I think it's if I definitely do. I mean, if you think back just say 2 or 3 years ago, we at Vertex were supporting around 400 fee impositions, and mostly in the green space area that you mentioned. Today we support about 1,200. So in a 3-year time period, it's gone up by a factor
Wow.
of three. And I don't think it's just in the environmental space. Also, we tend to think that it's going to also, and we see this because we have a lot of customers in the hospitality space. So they actually have to impose fees on what we call them neighborhood fees. So if you're at the airport and you buy a cup of coffee, there might be a port fee for that airport just because that's where you bought it. We're starting to see some places where trendy neighborhoods are actually starting to impose fees if you go out to dinner or something like that. And the thing about fees is that fees can be passed with relative ease. They're easy to audit because it's on a normally a per transaction basis. And so I think if you think about how local communities or local districts want to actually continue to raise revenue without raising the sales tax rate, fees are going to be a significant portion of that. And I will tell you this, that a lot of our customers are very aware of this and they want to make sure that at least we stay, apprised of making sure that in our monthly data update we get those fee positions updated with that as well so that they're charging proper fees as well. So
And
yes,
that's not really a sales tax, right? That's just a fee.
no, it's
But
not.
you gotta, if you're going to
Right.
send an invoice and put something on it, how else are you going to put it on there? Your
Right,
software can
exactly.
help with that. So it's
Hmm.
almost expanding your base of what you actually have to be collecting on an invoice. But that's a service to your end user and to the pass through of it. But the interesting thing, Colorado, we have Tabor, so we cannot increase our taxes without a vote of the people. So they're not going to vote for tax increases. So what do? We impose delivery fees, bag fees,
Yeah,
because fees are not a tax in Colorado.
yep.
And so far, so
That's
good. They've won
interesting.
on that. They've
Yep,
won.
we're
So
seeing that.
and
Yeah,
then
we're
that
seeing that.
fee
Yeah.
was a transportation bill. It was not a Department of Revenue bill. Department of Revenue was tasked with enforcing it and managing it and taking the input, but it was not a Department of Revenue bill. And I just had a meeting with Heidi Heidkamp. She is our executive director. She actually came out of retirement as the deputy back to be the executive director. And we asked her straight up because over my career, we've seen different advocacy at the Department of Revenue where they're pushing legislation rather than receiving it and having to comply with it. And their policy is they're going to go towards enforcing what the legislators want to do, right? They're
Yep.
not going to assert policy. So it is a push pull. Like you said, how do you assert policy that could be a detriment to another taxpayer? They're taking no sides. So just, okay, and then explaining
Yep.
to the legislators, this is going to be hard for us to implement. So just be mindful. We're going to need some more full-time equivalents to make it happen.
Yep. Exactly. Yep. Exactly.
Well, I'm sure there's a lot of digging into the nuts and bolts of like what that fee actually is to understand whether it's going to be part of the purchase price and is it taxable, and just really trying to assign like, and here's the new code for the, kind of that mapping code within the system for, the living wage fee when you go to a restaurant. Is it a tip?
Exactly.
Is it required because it's not optional, and just the taxability and the nuances of each one of those fees, I'm sure is just a huge, just undertaking to try to get behind what those actually mean.
And typically, the people
It
at the
is.
company don't have a clue how to apply tax law to that. So they're just winging it and hoping
Right.
and relying, if they have a vendor like you, they're going to provide them some information because they don't know it themselves or how to find the answer to it. That's why we have a career, but
No, it
not everybody can talk to us. So it's tough.
yeah, no, there's almost no guidance behind it, and the other thing to it is it's so very local that they pass these things and it's just imposed, and as you both said, it's you're kind of left to kind of figure it out on your own, and maybe it's analogous to some other place of adding some of these fees. So uh, a lot of again, not much guidance, have to collect it, have to remit it, and it's quite a burden actually on our customers to actually do that as well. So
Well, I remember when the delivery fee got imposed, and of course, within a year, it was raised a penny. I'm like, come on. So anyway, we it was mandatory. It had to be imposed. So there are many home rule cities in Colorado that were going to tax it because mandatory related to delivery. Delivery is taxable in those cities, not at the state level, depending on mandatory if it's you can choose blah blah blah. I mean, I'm like, these cities don't do this to us. That's a circuitous transaction. But imagine you've got to figure out how to do that. We did get them to back off on that by rounding up our Colorado Municipal League, which is similar to the Multi State Tax Commission, but it just represents the cities of Colorado. But really explaining, because there's such a disparity amongst the cities. So we were very grateful that, through some information, Denver especially decided to back off because they kind of set the standard around here. They're our biggest metro city. And their rate's 4.8% because they're a city and a county. That's double your state rate if you're going to tax some ancillary fee. So that was a really anxious creating time for me to tell our legislators and our Department of Revenue and our other cities, you can't do this to taxpayers. You're just going to be asking for trouble for them, and you're going to be putting them in trouble on an audit. We don't want that. So
Out of curiosity, is there one fee that you've heard of that you're just like, what? Like the green headphone fee in Fargo, North Dakota, because you bought a pair of green headphones. Is there anything that just kind of just completely being silly, and like, is there any
uh,
kind of fee that you've heard of that was just like, what?
no, I think I just expect it's going to be kind of a bit odd sometimes, but I will say this. I will say where you see some struggles is in Canada because it's your fees are based upon volumes, and so you have this graduated thing about where you have to impose the fee and how much the fee is. So if you really want to kind of see the how granular fees can go on a say a bottle of soda, like given like what volume is in it, that's the thing that really makes things tough, and they impose those fees kind of because they say the bigger the bottle, well, the more that it needs to be recycled or should be recycled, and so that's where you
Or
see
it
a
takes up
lot
more
of
room in a landfill or so interesting. So like
exact
a
no, you got it.
12-ounce
No,
can versus a 16.9-ounce plastic bottle versus a 2 liter, where not,
exactly. No,
interesting.
exactly. Um,
I had a situation with a client where it was like they're a convenience store and they would sell to go, right? Grab a bag of chips, or versus it's food for home consumption, buy a container or a big bag of chips versus a little bag of chips, or a package with all the little chips for your kids' lunches. So the package and the big container, all not taxable food for home consumption. But the one-off chip bag, which you could probably take to go, is actually takeout food subject to tax. So it's like, who can do that? Who could do that as a
yeah,
taxpayer? They also sold energy drinks. Okay, so I learned about energy drinks. I'm like, do you know how many energy drinks there are? When I went to law school, I drank Mountain Dew. I didn't ever drink coffee actually until my 40s, but I drank Mountain Dew, which is so bad for you. But regardless, I love that Mountain Dew. I drank my Mountain Dew. So I didn't know anything about all these crazy energy drinks. I mean, we're looking at their list of all the types of energy drinks they're selling, like over 1,000. And the distinction on the labeling is it could be a supplement, a nutritional, or a supplement label. If it was a nutritional
Right.
label, exempt. If it's a supplement label, taxable. Or if it has milk or coffee in it, food. Anyway, you can't figure that out. You could have the same can sitting on the shelf with two different labeling systems. You don't control the labeling as a convenience or anybody who buys an energy drink. So this poor convenience store is getting audited for this. And I'm thinking, this is crazy for you to expect them to manage this. And we got them out of the audit assessment, but it was very distressing. And I went to the grocery store and pulled the same can with two labels on the shelf right next to each other. Same product, different labelings. Like if you cannot make a distinction based on that, that's
Well,
craziness for
Judy,
a
do you
vendor.
remember when we were mapping kind of like a newer supplement, vitamin, whatever, we called my parents, who are food scientists, to like really get into the nuts and bolts of like what the definition under the FDA, because my mom was in regulatory with the FDA, private company, but dealt with the FDA a lot. So we called her to talk to her about those distinctions. And so those are all of those things that kind of bringing us back on topic that you all as a software vendor and as, chief tax officer have to,
Yep.
be aware of.
Right. So you
Have,
can have
a
the option,
team
right?
of people, right, to implement that and just, where technology is changing, right? When we first started working with a vendor, there was no code for infrastructure as a service because that wasn't really a thing. And then all of a sudden, everyone has AWS, is storing stuff in the cloud that we've got to come up with a mechanism for people to kind of assign that code correctly. And then before you can implement a code, you've got to know the rules behind it. And
Yeah. What
sometimes
really
in
is IAS? Yeah. Or
those newer
PAAS.
technologies,
Yeah.
there isn't a lot of rules
And you're building
because,
the tech stack together, not even separately sometimes. So it's like, what is it that you bought? Yeah.
um and I guess, we've talked about a few things, the evolution of fees and just kind of new taxes. Is there anything that Vertex or, you not as an employee of Vertex are really kind of interested in or keeping your eye on from kind of new tax policy that you might have to be kind of aware of, on the income tax side? We're really heavily watching, what states are doing with public law 86272 and what the MTC has come out regarding that. From a sales tax side, what are you all really kind of looking at crystal ball that, we're not going to hold you to?
hmm Um, I think I'll go back to something that's happened over the past couple of years, where a lot of states have provided a lot of relief in the personal income tax space. They've cut rates, or they've done something like that, and so they've they've allowed that to kind of happen as a policy decision. And I understand that because a lot of people did have a tough time during COVID, and so they wanted to provide some relief there. The second thing that is putting pressure on budgets, so that puts a pressure on budgets. The second thing that puts pressure on budgets is actually the devaluation of commercial real estate in the urban cores. So you're seeing this massive kind of revaluation because people are either hybrid work, or they're not having to go in 5 days a week, and so now these commercial buildings are being revalued, and so property tax revenues are actually starting to be greatly impacted. And I would say this, I would say as a funding mechanism between corporate and personal income taxes, property taxes, and sales and use taxes, that sales and use taxes is going to become a much greater place for funding, more prominent in the future. And I would say that because one thing that is true about sales and use tax, it's normally, even though we've talked about a lot of complexity around it, it's normally a little bit easier to get that and impose that tax. It collects much sooner than it does, say, for income tax purposes, because you're getting those remittances every month. And then the last thing too is it's really kind of based on a transaction, which is the economy moves along in a transaction. 2/3 of the economy is based upon all of this commercial activity by consumers. So given all of that and rolling that all together, I just think it's a preferred method of funding going forward. The other thing I would say this too is the data over the last, say, 60 or 70 years, if you look at all the economic downturns that have occurred, and there's been about 5 of them, the one tax between the income tax, property tax, and sales and use is sales and use goes down faster in hard economic times, but guess what? It comes back faster. So it's almost like a V curve going down and coming back, and it normally will restore itself within 2 quarters, maybe 3 at the most. Whereas if you look at the other taxes, income taxes and property taxes, it normally takes them anywhere from 8 to 9 quarters to actually go down and then come back. So so if I'm a legislator there and I'm thinking about like what's my preferred method of funding, what's the one that's most resilient against economic downturns, it's sales and use tax. And so I'm probably going to continue to raise rates. The one thing I think that still has to be decided by states is, are they going to broadly tax services? There's only about 8 or 10 states that actually broadly tax services. There is, I think you all know this, is there would be this decision that have to be made. Are you going to tax professional services like accounting, data management, professional architecture, those kinds of things, versus personal services like lawn care, daycare, and those kinds of things? Healthcare won't be, because obviously that's off the table. But the question is, which of those services are you going to tax? And the second thing is, there's a lot of resistance within Department of Revenues to actually go ahead and tax services, because they have to put out a bunch of new rules. It can be regressive in terms of that tax itself, depending on what they tax. And so the question is, that's kind of like one of the last kind of big pieces of the economy that they simply just aren't taxing. We'll have to wait and see. We thought for years that they would, but the DORs that we talked to, Department of Revenue directors, they're kind of they kind of aren't wanting to do that at this point. But let's see what happens. So those
I
are
feel
some
like they
thoughts
do
around
it
that.
through audit, like installation, training. I mean, they
I
just end
think
up
so.
grabbing
Yeah.
it through the taxability of the product. So my experience is they broaden, even if you're not bundling service with the product.
Right.
I mean, I feel like it's handled on the indirect way, audit by audit. I don't know if that's policy, but rather than actually putting it out there. So it's like secretly being enforced without actually
Yes.
legislatively being enacted.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's been a real trap for the unwary. And I think it's interesting in the professional services world, CPA services are taxable, like Connecticut and South Dakota and a few other states. Legal
Right.
services are not taxable anywhere. And that's about advocacy. And if you know software is still not taxed in a few states, that's advocacy,
Exactly.
right? California is
It
still
is.
not taxing software. A state of 30 million
Yeah.
humans that sells licenses all day long, and 30 million humans are buying all kinds of things. And I find that to be a fascinating political thing that we see across the nation. Why did you tax it? Why didn't you? And then it's materiality. I mean, I think about my moving from the big four to a regional firm, and really getting to know the middle of America. Very different tax policies, and probably honestly fine to do, because it's not a lot of humans that are affected by it, so easier to pass. And also, I think everybody knows about income tax. Not everybody sees sales tax, and like you said, it's a small amount on every invoice, so they're like,
Well, and that
oh, okay, whatever.
well, and that's something that I even kind of, as a, you know, Colorado resident, I live in the city and county of Denver, that almost every sales tax increase gets voted through, because it's just like when you think about, 0.5%, the tax base generally is a lot smaller, and they'll specifically assign it to, we're going to, fund children's food in schools, so we're going to increase the sales tax rate by 0.5%. But when I go and buy you know, a six pack of beer for $15, because I live in Colorado, right? That 0.5% doesn't mean a whole lot, but we did vote to decrease our income tax rate, and we have a flat rate for individuals and businesses. That went through the last two times it's been on. you know, on the ballots. So it's like sales tax got voted through, no problem, and like a clear majority, but the income tax also reduction got voted through and a pretty high majority as well. So we like I had been following that and making that connection, in my own home state. So yeah, that's a very, you know, something I can see right away
Well, you
as you
see
say
so
that.
many business owners. I mean, look where Jeff Bezos just moved to Florida. No personal income tax in Florida. Why do you think he moved there? There's no personal income tax in Washington either, but now they were going after that wealthy person tax. So he's
They
not going to
were,
get
yeah.
taxed by Washington even more, even though that's the heart of his business and where, he kind of got his start, but he's not going to give up all his income on, on a tax. So it is, some people have the wherewithal and the ability to kind of pivot and move and make different decisions in order to change their residency. And there's only 5 states without a personal income tax. So how many are desirable to live in compared to others? I don't know, but you see a lot of people moving to say personal income tax a lot in America in the wealthier ranks and the business owner ranks and so forth. So it is interesting.
Well, Mike, as we wrap up, is there that you any parting words you have for us? Anything that we should think about? And before that, we do really appreciate your expertise and what you're doing to help us all stay compliant. So, any parting words for our listeners?
Sure. First of all, it's been a wonderful day to be with both of you here today, and I've enjoyed it greatly in talking about a lot of these issues. Um, I would say this, there is one thing in terms of parting words. One thing I would say is that the technology that companies deploy in their tax department is really not just important from a governance issue, but it's really important from like an employee retention and recruiting issue as well. And so, to the extent that you have a very, very robust and very automated tech stack that serves your needs well with very little kind of manual kind of interference or influence, you want to do that because you want to continue to the competition for great people to work in your department is really stiff, and you need to really kind of have that. I've seen people leave certain really good companies where their tech stack wasn't modernized and go to other places that were maybe a little bit smaller, but they were much more efficient in what they were doing. So when you think about the conversation that you have in terms of funding for your technology stack, the don't always get kind of caught with like what have been the audit assessments and that kind of thing. It really should be focused on governance, and it really should be more focused on the retention and the quality of people that you can continue to hire, along with the fact that, Judy, something you said a long back in this thing is ultimately a core piece of what the tax department has to do, and they're a core component of it, is produce a proper invoice in a frictionless environment. I've talked about that before. So you really need some automated and some good tools to actually do that. So please consider when you have those conversations about funding within your company that those are kind of front and center. So that's what I would leave you with.
Yeah. And then, well, and I just want to wrap with, aren't you the oldest sales tax software company out there? I mean, aren't you first in line that you start? Do you know if that's true?
We are, yeah, we've been,
I mean, I feel like
yeah,
you
I think
are.
so.
Like
Yeah,
you're
we've
the
been at it for
oldest one
45
around.
years. Yeah.
Yeah. So like you're
Mhm.
kind of number one. You were the number one to get out
Thank
there.
you
And
very much. Yeah.
it's already shown all the things you've done with all the people you have to support you, the good tech stack you have, also
Yeah.
the robust rules and rates. I mean, that's just imperative, like you said, for good governance. And you're dealing with,
Mhm.
thousands of taxpayers, lots of money. You're making sure it goes into our state government's coffers. And it's a big deal to make things
Yes.
run
Yes.
around here. So thank you.
Truly. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mike. And this has been another episode of SALTovation. Till next time.